Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. In today's lecture, we're going to be covering Chapter 12. It's where we're going to start looking at experiments with more than one independent variable. So up until this point, even though we have been talking about experiments, we've mostly been focusing on experiments that have one independent and one dependent variable, keeping everything fairly simple. But now we're going to get into some slightly more complicated setups where we can have multiple independent variables. So as an overview for this chapter, we can talk about sort of a review of what we've seen with our one independent variable experiments, and then looking at sort of the interactions we're going to see with two independent variables or more than two independent variables, factorial designs, which is one way of setting up these multiple independent variable experiments, and then also how we can identify these when we're actually reading the literature, whether that be scientific journals or popular media. What things should we look for to identify these factorial designs? Now, to review experiments with only one independent variable, we're going to look at two examples. And then we're going to take these examples and carry them through the chapter as we start looking at how we can modify these experiments to be done with multiple independent variables. So we're going to go into a lot of detail for these because they're going to matter for the rest of the chapter. So the first of these examples from the textbook looks at investigating whether people are angry as drunks. So are people's levels of anger higher when they are intoxicated? So for this experiment, Aaron, Duke, and his colleagues had two different groups of participants come in. So their placebo group drank orange juice with a very, very small amount of vodka in it. Basically enough that they could smell and taste a little bit of alcohol, but not so much that it would actually affect them or make them drunk. In the actual experimental group, the participants were given, again, orange juice with alcohol in it, but this time there was enough alcohol in it to get them to a blood alcohol content of 0.10, which is legally intoxicated. So both groups were given something to drink, but only one was actually gotten to the point that they were drunk. So in our placebo group, they thought that they had had a certain quantity of alcohol, but it wasn't enough that they were drunk. And so once they had established that one group was intoxicated and the other group wasn't, they moved on to the next stage of the experiment, where the participants would be playing a computer game with what they were told was a partner who was in another room. In actuality, they were playing against the computer that had been programmed to make a certain number of mistakes. But when this quote-unquote player that they were playing against made a mistake, the participants were able to give that player a shock as some form of punishment. And so the players, or participants, could decide how intense of a shock they wanted to deliver, so more shocking or less shocking, but they could also decide on the duration of the shock. So do you want to deliver that shock for longer or for less time? And so we can actually look at these two graphs. So graph A was looking at the intensity of the shock. So how strong of a shock did our participants deliver? And so here we have intensity on our y-axis, and our groups on the x-axis for alcohol intake, our placebo group with not enough alcohol to be drunk, and our drunk group who had that blood alcohol content of 0.10 or higher. And we can see that our placebo group delivered overall less intense shocks, and the drunk group delivered, on average, more intense shocks, showing a difference between the two groups. And this pattern continues if we look at their duration of shock. So this time we have duration instead of intensity, but still placebo and drunk group. And we see another difference in how long, or the duration of the shock, between both groups, with the placebo delivering less long of a shock and the drunk group delivering more of a shock. And so the researchers concluded that the people who were drunk were angrier and were being more aggressive by delivering both more intense and longer duration shocks. For our second example, this study looked at cell phone use while driving. So in this case, it was done by Strayer and Drews, who instructed participants to talk on a hands-free cell phone. So not even holding a cell phone, but just having a conversation over the phone while playing a driving simulator. And this simulator was set up to be very realistic so that it could, as best as possible, approximate real driving conditions. This experiment was set up as a within groups experiment because the participants were measured multiple times during the experiment so that they could be compared to their own scores in the different segments, so they could be their own control. So there were 4 segments. 2 of them, they would be on the cell phones. They would be having a conversation with the researcher, the person who was running the experiment. They would chat about how their day was, things like that. So for 2 of the 4, they were on the cell phone, and for the other 2 of those 4 segments, they were not on the phone. And they counterbalanced it so that everybody got a different order, so you weren't on the phone first and then not on the phone. It was randomized. So they measured a bunch of different factors, but here we're just looking at breaking onset time. The idea here being that the shorter the breaking onset time, the shorter amount of time it takes for you to react to something on the road, the better it is. So the lower you score on this axis, the faster your reaction time, the less likely you are to hit something. And so here, for our cell phone group, we see that they have a much longer breaking onset time. So they had a much more delayed reaction to things popping up in the simulator. And the not on the phone group, or the people in that specific condition at that time, had a much shorter reaction times. They were a lot faster to start braking. So we're seeing that there's a relationship here that you drive better when you are not on a cell phone. And interestingly, not just when you're physically holding the phone, but even when you're just talking to someone on a phone somewhere else, which is kind of cool. Now, for both of those examples, that wasn't anything really new. We're looking at situations with one independent variable, one dependent variable, pretty standard. But now we're going to cross over into the realm of multiple independent variables. And we're going to start by talking about how experiments with more than one independent variable can actually show interactions. So we can call these an interaction effect or just an interaction. And this occurs when the effect of one independent variable depends on the level of another independent variable. So we're seeing an interaction between 2 independent variables so that we can determine sort of what's going on between the 2 of them. So what we see in a particular situation will depend on the level of both independent variables. So we are considering 2 independent variables that are driving this observation that we're making. So if we consider that cell phone and driving study, the researchers wanted to look at a second independent variable. So the second time around, they looked at age as a second independent variable. So they wanted to see if the effects of using a cell phone while driving, if that decrease in driving ability changed depending on age. So we're trying to describe this mathematically as a difference in differences. So in other words, if the effect of one independent variable, such as cell phone condition, and how that cell phone condition differs from the no cell phone condition, if that differs on the level of the other independent variable, so older drivers or younger drivers. So we're seeing if that relationship of you do better while driving without the cell phone versus with a cell phone holds the same whether they are old or young. And if we see a difference in that relationship, in that difference between the two conditions we started with, if there is a difference there in those differences, then we're seeing an interaction. And the terminology on this is a little bit weird, so we're going to walk through a couple of examples to try and get across what it is specifically we're getting at here. So under the heading of intuitive interactions in the textbook, the author walks through a couple of examples of interactions to help clarify what's going on with some of the terminology here. So the first of these interactions is asking, how much do you like hot food? And in a lot of cases, your liking of a food being hot is going to depend on what kind of food it is. So this graph here, as weird as it is to graph this, is saying that, okay, so we have our enjoyment of a food on this axis and then the kind of food on this axis with our two variables, hot versus cold, shown in different colors. So here, hot is our orange line, so we do not like ice cream when it's served hot, but we do like pancakes when they're served hot. And if we're asking about cold, we like ice cream when it's served cold, but we don't like pancakes when they're served hot. So our enjoyment depends on both what food it is and how it's served. So there's that interaction between the type of food and how it's being served, and the interaction between two of those independent variables will determine how we score on our dependent variable of how much we enjoy it. And we can use another example where we're looking at the proportion of time a dog sits. So the author is talking about their own rather stubborn dog who will sit only some of the time, and we can look at the conditions in which they will sit. So here you have the condition where you say nothing versus when you actually tell the dog to sit. So the dog is not going to sit spontaneously no matter what other independent variable is involved. If you say sit, their action depends on our other variable, which is whether or not you're holding a treat. So if you don't tell the dog to do anything, they're not going to do anything no matter what you're holding. But if you tell the dog to sit, they will sit if you're holding a treat, but not when there is no treat. And so because our two lines are two different second conditions, the two lines aren't parallel to each other because they are different angles. That's telling us that there is an interaction effect. And the same thing's going on over here, where these two lines are in different angles, so there's some kind of interaction that we're looking at. And we can actually frame this just a little bit differently because these independent variables, these two different conditions, are pretty much interchangeable. You can set up these graphs by swapping the two independent variables. So we've always had our dependent variable here on the y-axis, and the x-axis is going to be one of our independent variables, but it doesn't really matter which one. So this graph is the exact same information as here, just presented a little bit differently. So here we have what you say on the x-axis, and whether you're holding a treat or not as the different colored lines. But on this graph, we have what you say as the different colored lines, and whether you're holding a treat or not as that x-axis. But if we look at the information, if you don't have a treat, it doesn't matter if you tell the dog to sit or not, they're too stubborn and won't sit anyways. But if you're holding a treat, if you tell them to sit, this orange line here, then they're going to sit most of the time. But not if you don't tell them to sit. So same information, just presented in two different ways. So that's the logic behind these experiments with two independent variables. Now we can actually start talking about how would you set this up to actually run this kind of an experiment. And so in this case, you're going to use a factorial design. So this is a setup for an experiment in which there are two or more independent variables. And sometimes these independent variables will also be called factors, which is why it is a factorial design. Now, in most cases, when you're setting up a factorial design, you're going to end up crossing those two factors or more, if you have more. You cross them so that you end up with all possible combinations of those two factors. Now, to clarify what that means, we can actually look at our cell phone example, where we had on a cell phone versus not on a cell phone, and then they introduced that second independent variable of driver age, young and old. So you can set this up by crossing those levels, those 2 by 2, to get us a grid basically set up here with 4 different cells. And each cell is a unique combination of conditions. So we have young drivers on cell phones, young drivers not on cell phones, old drivers on cell phones, and old drivers not on cell phones. So if you've taken a genetics course, or if you've done even introductory biology, this kind of looks like a Punnett square, where you've gotten all of the possible combinations from your 2 starting points. So same basic idea, you're just taking your 2 and 2 and turning it into a 2 by 2 or 4 cells to get all of the possible combinations of conditions. Now, the astute of you may have noticed that we've been talking about independent variables. That's what the whole chapter is about, having multiple independent variables. But from our definition of independent variables, those are the things that the researchers are controlling or manipulating. But we've referred to the age of the driver here as an independent variable. And that's sort of a technicality. Things that are qualities of your participants are often called participant variables. So you can't actually manipulate the age of your drivers. They are either old or young. So they're not true independent variables, but when we're setting up these kinds of designs, when we're using these factorial designs, we will still treat them as independent variables, mostly just for ease of experimental setup. So it's a little bit easier to include them as something that is influencing our dependent variables, even if they are not pure manipulated variables. So here we're going to kind of include these in our definition of independent variables, specifically because we're using them in these factorial designs. So if you've been kind of wondering how these get included if they're not actively manipulated, that's because in factorial designs, you'll usually talk about independent variables as either manipulated variables, things that you are actually controlling, or participant variables that you can't really control, but you still want to include in your factorial design. All right. So for our next slide, we want to look at how factorial designs can test limits. So sometimes researchers are conducting factorial designs specifically to test whether an independent variable affects different kinds of people or people in different situations in the same way. So that starts sounding quite a bit like looking at generalizability, which it very much is. We're looking at, is this same relationship, is our relationship of performance being worse when you're on the phone versus not on the phone, is that relationship the same for different age groups? Is it the same for driving different vehicles? When is this relationship consistent and applicable, and when does it not generalize? So here we can look at, say, a different interpretation of our results. Actually, I don't think we had even talked about what they had seen when looking at on the phone versus off the phone when they introduced older and younger drivers. So we can look at that here. So same basic idea, we're looking at our factorial design here, where they note that our dependent variable is going to be breaking onset time. So how quickly are you reacting? And then we have our first independent variable, IV1, is the cell phone condition. Are you on or not on the phone? IV2 is our driver age, young versus old, and they would define this quite a bit better in the actual experiment, but that's fine. And they can present the values here, sort of the average of the group for each of these combinations of conditions. So each cell is a unique combination that we can look at, but of course it's a lot easier to look at this information on a graph. So for our young drivers in the on the phone condition, they have a reaction time just over 900 milliseconds. And when they're not on the phone, it's around 780 milliseconds. And so we have this downward slope here showing that they do better when they're not on the phone. They react faster when not on the phone. For our older drivers, we actually see the same kind of relationship here, where they're still doing better when they're not on the phone and worse when they're off the phone. The lines aren't directly overlapping because older drivers have slower reaction times overall. So this isn't something that's depending on, that is specifically an interaction with age and being on the phone or not on the phone. This is just that older drivers have a slower reaction time no matter what. So we can tell that there's no reaction, or there's no interaction here, because the two lines are parallel. So we're indicating that talking on a cell phone and your performance because of talking on a cell phone is not dependent on age. So when we're comparing these things, if you're looking for those interactions, you're looking for non-parallel lines. That's our major indicator here. And so I've already said that we can test generalizability by looking at different conditions. Does this relationship apply for different ages? And in your mind, you should have already made the connection between generalizability and that testing for external validity. So here we can look at another example, this time with our experiment looking at drunk versus placebo groups and how intense of a shock they delivered. Here we're just looking at intensity, not duration, because it's easier to just look at one to compare. But here they wanted to test if that same relationship, that same idea of the people who are drunk are more aggressive than the people who are not drunk, that placebo group, they wanted to see if that would hold true for people of different sizes. So they basically wanted to test the stereotype of the angry, large, drunk man. So here they have light men, so around 150 pounds, and heavy men, 215 pounds, and how they reacted, so what was the intensity of the shocks they delivered, depending on what group they were in. So our independent variables are the weight of the participants. So again, this is a participant variable, not something you can manipulate, but we're counting it as an independent variable here. And then we also have our second independent variable being drunk or placebo, so drunk or not drunk. And so we can look at the relationship here. For the drunk group, the lighter men delivered less intense shocks than the heavier men. And in the placebo group, the light men delivered slightly heavier shocks than the heavy men, and that's specifically when they weren't drunk. So here we have non-parallel lines, so we can say for sure that there's some kind of interaction going on. And we can flip our two independent variables again, look at the same information, just presented a little bit differently. And so here we have our placebo group and our drunk group on that x-axis with the different colors indicating light or heavy. So in the placebo group, light men delivered more intense shocks than heavy men, and in the drunk group, the heavy men delivered more intense shocks than the light men. So you can compare sort of within your independent variable or between the two independent variables when looking at your other variable. So you can look at this information a whole bunch of different ways. But this is telling us that there is some kind of interaction going on here. So this effect of alcohol of being more aggressive when drunk versus sober is a lot more pronounced. That difference in differences is stronger for heavier men. And to bring back another term that we talked about earlier on in the course, we can talk about how these interactions actually show the action of moderators. So we talked about moderators way back when we were looking at correlation type studies. But here, for these experimental studies, and specifically these factorial designs, we can talk about a moderator as an independent variable that changes the relationship between a different independent variable and the dependent variable. So having a moderator causes or results in an interaction. So the effect of one independent variable depends on or is moderated by the level of another independent variable. So for example, using this layout that we have here, body weight moderates the effect of alcohol on aggression, or the effect of alcohol on aggression depends on the body weight of the participant. So more terminology that you can use to talk about these kinds of interactions. So for our next slide, we can talk about the fact that factorial designs can also be used to test theories. So using a factorial design, we can look at the example of testing that theory of alcohol cues. And we're also going to talk about another example of using an interaction to test a memory theory. So we want to see what happens when we're trying to test specific theories. So let's look at the first of these examples. So using a factorial design to specifically test a theory of alcohol cues. And so people have asked for a very long time why alcohol causes aggression. Because it isn't actually a universal thing. It doesn't always cause aggression, and there's some interesting research in that area. So there's lots and lots of theories about this. One theory that we're going to focus on for this example is that alcohol can become cognitively associated with thoughts of aggression. So people link or associate alcohol and being aggressive, and so because of that association, people will behave aggressively when drinking alcohol. So there's maybe something going on there. So for this particular experiment, this was done by Bartholow and Hines in 2006, and they tested this exact theory by having their participants view images and words on a computer monitor. They had people come in and sit in front of a computer and see images and words, and they were to indicate whether a string of letters was a word or a non-word. So they had to pay attention to the words to understand if it was actually a word or if it was just nonsense of letters. And some of the words were aggression related and some of them were neutral. So before they were shown each string of letters, their word strings, participants would be briefly primed with a photo on the screen. So sometimes the photo would be related to alcohol, and other times it would be a neutral photo, something like a plant. And so the researchers hypothesized that participants would respond more quickly to identify aggression-related words. So because aggression is something that we are primed to respond to, because it's something we respond to quickly, we should respond to aggression words faster. And so for our factorial design here, we have beforehand where they shown an alcohol photo or a plant photo. And then for the words, were they aggression-related words or were they neutral? So was it something aggressive or was it neutral? And so for our setup, we have 4 unique combinations. So we get 4 cells here. And then they could measure the response time, so how long, for the dependent variable, their reaction time. How long did it take them to click the button to indicate that it was aggressive or non-aggressive? And so if we hop to the next slide here, we have this same setup, but this time with their actual reaction times inserted into the cells. And yet again, I'm not a huge fan of the written explanation. I'd much rather look at a graph to show me those relationships. So here we have our reaction time, our dependent variable on that y-axis again. And then on the bottom, we have a photo type as one of our independent variables. So alcohol photo versus plant photo. And then up here we have aggression-related words as the darker line and neutral words as the lighter line. And so the same as with our breaking reaction times, a lower score here indicates a faster response. So for our aggression words, this darker blue line, we're seeing that after having seen an alcohol photo, after they were primed with a picture of alcohol, the people were a lot faster to identify aggression words than they were to identify neutral words. When they had been primed with a plant photo, they were a lot faster to identify neutral words than they were to identify aggressive words. Or if we wanted to frame it a different way, when they were identifying aggression-related words, they responded faster when they saw alcohol first versus when they saw plants first. Or the opposite for our neutral words. And so when it comes to priming and reaction times, what the researchers are mostly expecting is that you will respond faster when there is a cognitive match between the thing that you were primed with and the thing you're identifying. So the idea here is if you are faster at linking alcohol and aggression-related words, then you cognitively associate alcohol and aggression. And so the other way would be sort of plant photos being neutral images and neutral words being easier to identify when you've seen a neutral image. Then you have this cognitive association between neutral images and neutral words, which also kind of makes sense. So this setup, this experiment here, showed us that we have this match where people associate alcohol with aggression, and neutral things are associated with other neutral things. Pretty much exactly what they had predicted. So for our second example, we can use an interaction to test a memory theory. So very similar setup where we have a 2x2 factorial design. And so in this case, the researchers wanted to use this factorial design to test their theory about why memory develops with age. So this study was testing the idea that adults remember more than children do just because they have more accumulated knowledge. So adults are older and have experienced more things, so they are better at remembering things because of all that experience. So the researchers wanted to test if there are sort of other things going on here. And specifically, they wanted to look at, well, what happens if we're testing children in an area that they are experts? So can children's memory capacity be better than adults if they know a lot about the topic. And so in this case, we have child chess experts, so children who have grown up playing chess, who play chess all the time, when this is the thing that they are very good at, versus adult novices. So specifically adults who are not good at chess. They haven't learned to play chess, they haven't played a ton of chess. So they wanted to compare these children who have lots of chess experience but not lots of general life experience versus adults that should have, theoretically, a lot of general life experience, but very little chess experience. So that's our first independent variable, which is our type of participant. And the second independent variable is going to be what we are presenting them with, what kind of memory task they're presented with. And so one of the types of memory tasks was remembering chess pieces. And the other task is remembering just digits that don't have any value assigned to them. So they don't have an associated function like a chess piece. And then our dependent variable, the thing that we're measuring here, is the number of items they recalled. So for the chess pieces, how many chess pieces did they recall? Or for the digit memory test, how many digits did they recall? And so we have our 4 different cells with the value of the DV that they recalled. And we can look at that on a graph again with our dependent variable on the y-axis, so number of items recalled. And then on the x-axis, we have our participant type, child chess expert versus adult novice. And again, dark blue is the chess pieces they recalled, and the lighter blue is the digits they recall. So this line here is the darker blue, and so child chess experts recalled more chess pieces than adult novices could. But when we were looking at digits, the child chess experts recalled fewer digits than adult novices did. So we're seeing that while adults have a better memory overall, so for digits, than the children did, the children have a better memory than the adults in a domain that they have more knowledge. So in the thing that they are experts in, they have a better memory. So we've gone through the logic of these factorial designs, and we've talked about how we can set them up and maybe even start looking at some of the outcomes with these graphs. But if we actually want to start interpreting the results of these studies, if we want to get into them a little bit more statistically, then we have a couple of things to look at. So we're going to start talking about main effects and interactions. So when we're looking at our main effect, we're asking, is there an overall difference? For interactions, we're looking for that interaction between our 2 independent variables. Ask, is there a difference in differences? Does it depend on the values of our 2 different IVs? And then we'll get into some things that might be more important than main effects and what we're looking at in a standard 2x2 factorial. So let's actually look at interpreting this. So this is our overview for the next couple of slides, and we're going to go through each of these. So for our main effect, we're looking at the overall effect of one independent variable on the dependent variable, averaging over levels of the other independent variable. So if we switch to the next slide here, if we want to look at our main effect for our first IV for phototype from our example of priming and word identification for alcohol cues. So our phototypes are alcohol versus plant photos. And so for our main effect, we're looking at the difference between our average response to alcohol photos and our average response to plant photos. So we are caring about our phototype, alcohol or plant, by averaging the response to alcohol when it's in either the aggressive or neutral word condition. So you average those together to get our overall reaction time when alcohol is the photo versus our average responding time, so this plus this divided by 2 to average them together to get our overall reaction time to plant photo. And so you can get your main effect for your first IV, but you can also get a second main effect for your second IV. So depending on the number of independent variables you're looking at, you should get an equivalent number of main effects. So if we were to scale this up and look at 3 independent variables, we would be looking at 3 different main effects. But we'll look at larger samples in just a minute. But so here, if we wanted to look at that main effect for IV2 for our word types, we're looking at what is the responding to aggressive words by averaging between the 2 phototypes, because we're not caring about the phototypes, we're just caring about the word types right now. So add these 2 together, divide by 2. And what about for neutral words? Add those together and divide by 2. And our main effect is looking at our overall responding to aggressive versus neutral words. So when we're looking at these main effects, we're just looking at a simple overall difference between the 2 levels of the independent variable that we're looking at the moment. Are we caring about IV1 or IV2? Is there a difference between those 2 levels overall? And like we said, if you have 2 IVs, you're going to have 2 main effects. 3 IVs is 3 main effects, so on and so forth. Now, to get that overall main effect, to get the difference between this and this, we do have to calculate our marginal means, which is just the act of getting the average of responding to each of the 2 conditions that we're not caring about right now. So our marginal mean for aggressive word types is going to be the average of the responding to aggressive words when shown alcohol versus when shown plants. So you are taking just a straight average if the number of participants in each group is equal. When you're getting into real research, sometimes you have different numbers of participants in different cells, and it kind of makes your marginal means a little bit more complicated to calculate. But they basically just become a weighted average at that point. For our sake, we're going to just assume equal n's, so assume equal numbers of participants, and so our marginal means will just be the average for this particular type of response. And so if we actually want to look at this information, so our marginal mean for aggressive word types is going to be 555. For neutral word types, it's 557. Now, if we wanted to compare those 2, if we wanted to look at the main effect, we can sort of hand wave some of the calculations that would happen in the background, and we can just, by looking at these, tell that they're very, very close together. There's a difference of 2 milliseconds here. So we can pretty much tell right off the bat that there's not going to be any main effect of word type, because these 2 numbers, our 2 marginal means, are too close together. And if we do the same thing, we look down here, and if we were looking at sort of our marginal mean for alcohol, when we average it between aggressive and neutral word types, we get 556.5 and 555.5 when we're looking at plants, and these 2 are really close together again. So in this case, with this example, we're seeing no main effects for either of our independent variables. So we could say that there is no main effect of phototype, and there is no main effect of word type in this experiment. Now, what if we looked at a different example? So in this case, we can look at our body weight versus drinking condition example. So if we wanted to look at our marginal means for light men, and we average between the placebo and the drunk group, we're going to get 5.55. And then how about heavy men in the placebo versus drunk group? We can average those out and we can get 5.96. This is starting to look a little bit more different, maybe. But where we really start to see differences is when we look at the difference between our placebo group and our drunk group. So if we look at our main effect of drinking condition, we are comparing 4.91 and 6.60. So again, we're not doing the physical calculations to tell the difference to find out that this is a significant main effect. But I can tell you that this here is set up to be a significant main effect. So here we would say that there is a significant main effect of drinking condition in this experiment. And we can actually kind of see this if I go back. Let's find, so here for our alcohol and plant images versus aggressive and neutral words, because this is sort of a straight cross, there's pretty much an X here where the average of all of our conditions, if we take the average of all of these lines, we're going to end up with something that kind of looks like this, which is no real effect that we're observing. But if we scoot back even further, if I can find the graph for our drunk versus placebo group, if we found sort of the middle of these two lines, we're still seeing a line with a slope, which would be indicative of there being a main effect. And I just point that out. The textbook doesn't actually do that, but for me, I find it easier to visualize on a graph as opposed to looking at numbers in a table, just because that's how my brain works. So when you're taking the average of those two different conditions, those two different lines, if you're still going to have a slope, that's another way you can see those main effects. All right, back to the regularly scheduled programming. So if we want to look at these interactions, so is there actually a difference in differences? So when we were looking at main effects, you have two main effects if you have two independent variables. So you have one main effect per independent variable. But when we're looking at the interactions, we're looking at the interaction between two independent variables. So if you have two independent variables, then you get one interaction effect to look for. And so this is where we're actually asking, is there a difference in the differences for this particular interaction? So again, with our photo type versus word type, we can calculate our difference for each of these groups. So here, it's actually really hard to see on the PowerPoint slide. This is a little bit easier to visualize in the textbook, but we're looking at the difference between alcohol and aggressive words and alcohol and neutral words. And so the difference between those is minus 11. So if we subtract this and this, we get minus 11. If we subtract this and this, so for plant images, aggressive and neutral words, our difference is 7. So we're asking, is there a difference between the difference we get from these and the difference we get from these? So is minus 11 different from 7? And the answer is yes. So yes, there is an interaction. We have a difference in differences. And we can look at this again with our cell phones and age setup. So on the cell phone versus not on the cell phone, young drivers versus old drivers. And so here we're looking at the difference for old drivers on the cell phone versus not on the cell phone, young drivers on the cell phone versus not on the cell phone. So the difference for young drivers is 132. The difference for older drivers is 174. And again, the textbook is kind of hand-waving the statistics that go on behind the scenes here to calculate these interactions. So they are just telling us that in this case, with this specific data set, that difference is not significantly different. So this 174 is not significantly larger than 132 based on the data that we're calculating this from. So if you were to run the proper statistics on this, you would get a p-value that was smaller than our cutoff for acceptable chance. Now, if we wanted to look at this difference in differences, it's much easier to detect these from a graph than actually calculating them from a table, which is what I've been saying all along. I'm not a data in a table kind of person. I'd much prefer the graphs. So if the results are plotted in a line graph, kind of like these guys here, you look to see if the lines are parallel. So we have our aggression-related words and neutral words when you are primed with an alcohol photo or a plant photo, and these two lines aren't parallel. So we know that there's an interaction here. Whereas if we look at this graph again, so younger versus older drivers on a cell phone or not on a cell phone, the two lines are pretty much parallel, so there's no interaction between your independent variables. So this is much easier to quickly look at than looking at the tables. Now we can present this in another different way, so we can detect these interactions from a different kind of graph. So instead of our line graphs, we're now going to look at bar graphs. And so we can compare where the pink is still aggression-related words, orange is neutral words, alcohol photos for priming, plant photos for priming, and we have sort of a low pink and a high orange, and then a high pink and a low orange, versus this graph, where for our young drivers in pink, old drivers in orange on the cell phone versus not on the cell phone, we're seeing the same pattern in both sets of bars here. So here we have a reversal, so an interaction, but here we have the same pattern on both sides. So if you see that reversal, we're seeing an interaction, but if we're seeing the same pattern of differences, then there's no interaction. So there's lots of different ways that we can look at this data to make that interpretation. Now, when we're talking about these interactions, I've already been using some of this terminology already, but we can actually talk about the best way to describe these interactions in words. So you should start with one level of your first independent variable and explain what is happening with the second independent variable at that level. Then you move on to the next level of your first independent variable and do the same thing. So we have some examples here. So again, we have our chess pieces, using the examples over and over again. So child chess experts and adult novices being tested with chess pieces versus digits. We can say child chess experts can remember more chess pieces than digits, so more chess pieces than digits, but adult chess novices remember more digits than chess pieces. So that's how they've framed this. We can also talk about it if we flip our two independent variables. So we can flip these graphs, and you can flip the way you talk about it as well. Don't feel like you are stuck to just saying it in one way, which is why the textbook lets us show these graphs flipped with our independent variables sort of one up here, one down here, or the opposite arrangement. So for our other example, we can look at so heavy in green, light in orange, placebo versus drunk groups, and you can say the drunk group was more aggressive than the placebo group, especially for heavy men. So the drunk group was more aggressive than the placebo group, this more than this, especially for heavy men. So we're saying especially in this line. So this one actually didn't switch the graph around to make that description, but it let us talk about one independent variable and how that compared to the second independent variable. So both of these are fine ways to talk about these interactions. So this is the sort of by the book way. And this is when you can say, yeah, this pattern is what we see, especially for or depending on the weight of the group. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. Now, when we're setting up these experiments, and we've talked about, you can have your main effects, you can have your interactions, but which one do you actually care about? And in a lot of cases, the interactions are going to be more important and possibly more interesting than the main effects. So when a study shows both a main effect and an interaction, we usually care more about that interaction. So there may be real differences in those marginal means. We may have a main effect, but it's exciting to actually see the interaction. And this is especially important in psychological research, where a lot of what we're looking at isn't an independent variable. So, well, it is labeled as an independent variable, but it's not something that operates completely on its own. So these interactions let us see how things change with other conditions, but we don't tend to see like depression. Depression doesn't just exist on its own. We also care about how it interacts with other factors. So these interactions are very important for us, and we care a lot about what's going on for those interactions. Now, these two tables here are going to be showing a bunch of possible things that we can see, a bunch of possible main effects and interactions that you could see in a 2x2 factorial. So they're going to be using that on a cell phone, not on a cell phone, young drivers, old drivers, and they're going to put it together in all of the possible combinations that we could see. So we'll look at the first couple of these, but these are pretty easy to walk through by yourselves, so we don't really need to take a ton of time to do it as a group. So for the first one, main effect of cell phone, no. Main effect for age, no. So if we look here, these two are the same and these two are the same, so there's no main effect for either of our independent variables. Is there an age by cell phone interaction? Are these two lines not parallel? The answer is yes. So younger drivers on a cell phone cause more accidents and older drivers on a cell phone cause fewer accidents. So that's what they're describing here. And then we could look at the next one. So there's no main effect for cell phone, but there is a main effect for age, where younger drivers have more accidents, but no age by cell phone interaction. So we have two parallel lines, but the young drivers cause more accidents overall, regardless of whether they're on a cell phone or not, because there's no main effect of cell phones. So you can go through each of these and kind of look at what they're describing in each case. So what are you visualizing if we have a main effect or not a main effect for either of our independent variables? And what does it look like if there is or isn't an interaction? So this is tons of examples here. Pretty much every possible interaction that they could think of, they put together here with artificial data just to give us these nice graphs to look at. So the next few slides are going to be looking at factorial variation. So changing up our standard 2x2 factorial and looking at a couple of different variations. So what about an independent variable that has more than two levels, or even within groups, factorial designs? And then we're going to work our way down to what happens when we add a third independent variable. What happens if we're looking at 3 instead of 2? So lots of different options here. So first, if we want to look at independent groups, factorial designs. So if we can talk about both independent variables being studied as independent groups. This might be the way that you have been thinking about our factorial designs, our 2x2 layouts. And this is the case where we have sort of each cell is going to consist of its own group. So I can actually show a visual of this on the next slide. So with our independent groups, if we use that priming with a picture of alcohol or a picture of a plant, and then identifying neutral versus aggression-related words, for this independent group setup, we would have sort of 12 individuals in the alcohol image, then neutral word, identifying. We would have an additional 12 individuals in the plant photo, then neutral words, and so on and so forth, giving us 4 independent groups of 12 people, so 48 people total. So this could also be known as a between subjects factorial design. And so these are sometimes very common to be seen. You might think of having sort of different groups only exposed to certain conditions, but as we talked about before, we run into some issues where if you have entirely new sets of individuals in each cell, then you end up needing a lot more individuals than if you used a different design. The design that actually probably works a little bit better with that showing a picture of alcohol plant and then identifying neutral or aggressive words is probably a full within groups design, where the same 12 people are shown alcohol pictures and plant pictures and are then asked to identify both neutral words and aggression-related words. So you can compare the same people across all 4 different unique conditions. And if we had this specific combination, this within groups setup, then you would only need 12 people because all 4 groups are the same 12 people. And then we come across this next situation, and this is the mixed design. So it's going to be somewhere in between our independent groups design and our within groups design. And so for these mixed factorial designs, we have the description on the next slide. So in these situations, for one independent variable, that's going to be manipulated as an independent group setup, and the other variable is manipulated as a within groups setup. So this is a split between our within groups design and the independence group design, because it's going to be kind of halfway between the two. So here we would have the first group of 12 are always shown alcohol photos, but after being shown those photos of alcohol, they would be shown either a neutral word or an aggression-related word that they'd have to identify. So they're always shown level 1 of one independent variable, but they are shown both levels of your second independent variable. And then you'd have another group, individuals 13 through 24, who are always shown plant photos, so level 2 of that first independent variable, but then they're also shown both levels of the second independent variable. So like we said, sort of half and half between our independent groups and within groups setups. And because of that, they use sort of twice as many individuals as the within groups, but half as many individuals as an independent group sample. So right in the middle. So next, let's look at what would happen if we wanted to increase the number of levels of an independent variable. So if we use our cell phone example, where we were looking at young and old drivers and whether they had a hands-free cell phone, and in this case, instead of just no phone, they're also looking at a handheld cell phone. So now we have 3 cell phone conditions. So in the original study, they were talking hands-free on a cell phone. So they weren't holding anything. they were just having a conversation while driving, or there was no phone involved, they weren't having a conversation while driving. This third variable that's introduced is that they actually have a cell phone and are having a conversation, but they are also holding that cell phone. So it's not hands-free. They're also dealing with that extra thing where they are holding that cell phone. So in this situation, if we want to look at our results, because you know how much I don't like these tables, now that we've gone through this a few times, we can look at our dependent variable here on the y-axis. And this time on our x-axis, we have 3 different options for this one of our independent variables, that cell phone condition. So hands-free, handheld, or no phone. And then we still have our darker blue line are the younger drivers, and the lighter blue line is our older drivers. And so we can look at our younger drivers. They performed the worst. They had the slowest braking onset time when using a handheld cell phone. The next worst would be hands-free cell phone, and then the last would be no cell phone. And if we look at our old drivers, we actually see the same relationship here, where handheld cell phone is the worst, then hands-free cell phone, then no cell phone. But the same as what we saw last time, we see that the older drivers have a reduced reaction time overall compared to the young drivers. And once again, we're seeing here that the lines are pretty much parallel. These are starting to get really close together, but if we ran the statistics on this, this would probably show up as no significant interaction yet again, just as a brief interpretation of what we're seeing here. Now, before we move on to our next addition to this, so far we've been talking about our 2x2 factorial designs. And so we were talking about 2x2 because we have 2 independent variables that each have 2 levels. So when we're talking about that 2x2, it's actually looking at the levels of each of those factorials designs, or each of those independent variables. So in this case, we now have a 3x2. So our first independent variable has 3 levels, and our second has 2 levels. So if we talked about this kind of a setup, this is a 3x2 or a 2x3 factorial design, depending on which one you're talking about first and second. So let's consider another addition. What if these researchers, instead of just looking at young and old drivers, what if they started looking at more refined divisions of age? What if they looked at, for example, 20 to 29, 30 to 49, 50 to 69, and older than 70? So now we're still looking at hands-free, handheld, no cell phone conditions, but we now have 4 different age groups. So now we have this 3x4 factorial, where our first independent variable has 3 different levels, and our second has 4 levels. So a 3x4 factorial design. And so you can still apply your main effects. So you calculate your marginal means for each of these and seeing if there's any differences between them. And then you can look at the graph. This time we still have the same setup with our 3 cell phone conditions along the x-axis, braking onset on the y-axis, and then 4 different shades of blue showing the different ages. And the same basic relationship here, where older individuals are showing a overall slower reaction time. But now that we've picked apart and focused on more refined age groups, we see that these lines are no longer parallel. They're still pretty darn close to parallel, but we do see some differing line slopes here. So we could run our statistics here to determine if our main effects and our interactions for all of these setups would be statistically significant. And again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but it is something you can do when you're running this kind of research. All right, so the next slide is looking at what happens when we increase our number of independent variables. So instead of looking at hands-free and no cell phone with young and old drivers, just those conditions, now we're looking at a third independent variable, which is going to be the kind of traffic they're driving in. So light traffic versus heavy traffic. So now we have one independent variable is cell phone or no cell phone. A second independent variable is age of the driver. And our third independent variable is the traffic condition. So our dependent variable is still that braking onset time or the reaction time. And those scores are listed in each of the cells here. And so because we're now looking at 3 different dimensions, with our graphs, we can only look at sort of 2 of our independent variables at a time. So we end up seeing 2 different graphs, sort of one for light traffic and one for heavy traffic, to include the visuals for that third independent variable. And so if we were interpreting our results here, in light traffic, the younger drivers perform fairly well whether they are hands-free or no cell phone. There seems to be no real difference there in their reaction time. For older drivers, this lighter line, they tend to have a slower reaction time when hands-free than on no cell phone, even in that light traffic. In heavy traffic, this interaction, this difference in slopes, seems to go away because now we have 2 parallel lines where the younger drivers, their performance drops, their reaction time increases when they have to be on the hands-free versus no cell phone, so they have a slower reaction time hands-free than they do on no cell phone. And the older drivers have the same pattern, slower reaction hands-free than with no cell phone, but with that overall slower reaction time in the older drivers. So there's no interaction in heavy traffic. So we can say that there's some kind of effect of light versus heavy traffic here in terms of at least one of these interactions. So we're not going to, again, go into the specifics of calculating this out, but we can talk about this as a 2 by 2 by 2 factorial design. So we have 3 different independent variables, each of which has 2 different levels. And so if we hand wave those calculations, we can look at our main effect for cell phone versus control. So did they have a cell phone or not? And so we can look at our marginal mean for cell phone and our marginal mean for no cell phone. Is there a significant difference between these 2 numbers? Main effect for driver age. So young drivers versus old drivers, these 2 numbers here. And we can have a main effect for traffic conditions, so light traffic versus heavy traffic. And so for here, we're kind of expanding on our rule earlier on where we said if you have 2 independent variables, you have 2 main effects. So with 3 independent variables, we have 3 main effects. And so this will scale. And for each of these, we're going to again sort of hand wave and say that there is a significant main effect for all 3. So driving or braking onset time, their reaction time is higher on the cell phone overall across all of the other conditions. The older drivers have a slower reaction time than younger drivers overall. And there is a slower reaction time in heavy traffic overall than light traffic. So those are our three main effects. Now, if we wanted to look at our interactions, we're basically looking at how many ways can we combine two of our three independent variables. And so if you have three independent variables, there are actually three ways that you can have two-way interactions. And so what I mean by that is, if we grab my drawing utensil here, so if you have A, B, and C as your three independent variables, you can have A and B, you can have B and C, or you can have A and C. Those are all of your possible combinations of those three letters when you pick two of them. So from our three independent variables, we end up with three two-way interactions that we can look at. So we can look at the comparison of driver age and light versus heavy traffic. And so we can just look at, so if we average across the two different cell phone conditions, what do we see for young drivers in light traffic? And if we average across cell phone conditions, what do we see for young drivers in heavy traffic? Old drivers in light traffic, old drivers in heavy traffic. And we can graph those over here, and we can see that these lines aren't parallel, so there is an interaction here. So there's an interaction between age and traffic condition. And so for this one here, we can look at cell phone condition and driver age. So for young drivers on the cell phone, if we average across all traffic conditions, what do they tend, or what is their average responding time? When we average across the traffic conditions, what is the average stopping time for no cell phone with young drivers? So on and so forth. So you can pick these all apart, and if we see parallel lines, then we can say that there's no interaction. If they are not parallel, if they're sort of angled like this, you could say that there is an interaction. For something like this graph here, where they look fairly close to parallel but not quite, you would have to follow up with the statistical tests to make sure that there is actually a significant interaction. Like I said, we're kind of hand-waving that part for this course because calculating these and interpreting the statistics is a little bit more than what we need to cover. And so if we have three main effects and we have three potential two-way interactions, we also have one more thing that we can look at, and this is a three-way interaction. So in a three-way design, we have three independent variables that we're looking at. So we're asking for this three-way interaction is, are the two-way interactions different? Is there a difference in differences in looking at these two-way interactions? So is there a difference in the differences between the differences? I guess if we think it back that far away. And so we can have two main interpretations here. So is there a three-way interaction? If we look at our overall, all three of our independent variables represented on a graph, or in this case, two graphs, so we can see them side by side, is there an interaction? Is there a difference between this one and this one? And overall, we're seeing mostly parallel slopes that are all fairly similar. So no, there is no, there's no two-way interaction here and no two-way interaction here. And they're both showing the same not interacting. So there's a zero interaction for both of these. So we have no overall three-way interaction. In the second option down here, we have these two lines crossing, so definitely not parallel. And these two are diverging from one another, so they are definitely not parallel. So we're seeing a crossing interaction there and a spreading interaction here. So they're both showing interactions, but they're also both showing different interactions. So the patterns aren't the same, in this graph versus this graph. And so because they're showing different two-way interactions, we can say that there is a three-way interaction. And so again, there are ways that you can calculate this statistically, but just by looking at the images, you can get that same idea. And this slide is just the exact same, just with this image slightly smaller, so we can skip over that. All right, so we've talked about all of our possible interactions and our main effects and two- and three-way interactions. Why do we care about all of these interactions? We kind of talked about the fact earlier on that the interactions are the interesting part. And this is especially true for our psychological studies. So when we're looking at psychological studies, there tends to be more going on. And I kind of jumped the gun and talked about this earlier on when we mentioned why the interactions are more important than main effects, but still holds true. A lot of psychological studies, we're going to encounter multiple variables, multiple independent variables that are influencing our dependent variables. So having multiple independent variables having an effect on that dependent variable, we have multiple things that we care about. And specifically, when they're all working together, we often encounter these interactions. There's always some kind of influence going on. So we care a lot about these interactions because they become very relevant for a lot of psychological research. So even if you only find a main effect, you really do want to check for these interactions because there could be something else going on and you'd rather get the full picture. So if we've talked about what these kinds of factorial designs are, how we set them up, how we look at them, that's all well and good, but how do you actually identify studies that are using these kinds of designs? So when we're trying to identify factorial designs in our empirical journal articles, that's going to be a little bit easier than, say, in the popular media. So usually you're going to see factorial notation. They're going to say a blank by blank by blank factorial design or something similar like usually you'll see something like a 2 by 2 by 2 ANOVA was run to compare groups or something like that. If you start seeing this number by number by number, it's usually referring to this factorial notation for a factorial design. And when you get into the results section, they're going to start talking about whether the main effects or the interactions were significant. And they should specify if it is a 2 or a 3 or more way interaction that they're talking about. So they're still going to talk about significance or a p-value, and they're usually going to see some kind of MANOVA, which would be a multivariate ANOVA, the actual specific statistical experiment or statistical calculation you would do in this situation. And instead of looking at something like an R or a T, MANOVAs and ANOVAs use an F. So just another variable to calculate. And so same thing, most of these p-values, their cutoff for significance will be stated, but the standard is going to be that 0.05 in most situations. When it comes to our popular press articles, when you're looking at the media, it's a little bit harder to actually identify these factorial designs. So popular media articles tend not to specify what kind of design was used. And that's because the journalists are trying to simplify the research so that the general population can understand it. So you're not going to see them refer to a 2 by 2 factorial design. Instead, you're going to have to look for some keywords. So if you see things like, it depends on a particular situation, or you see this interaction only when, that's usually indicative of a factorial design. So they might say something like, driving ability while talking on a cell phone depends on the age of the driver. So by talking about multiple variables there and saying that it depends, that would be a pretty good indication of it being a factorial design. You can also look for participant variables, things like age or gender or ethnicity. So sometimes those participant variables might act as a moderator for another independent variable being talked about. And so whenever we have a moderator, that's telling us that there is a interaction there. And if we're looking at interactions, therefore there's going to be a factorial design. So we could say something like older adults took longer to break while talking on a cell phone, whereas younger adults didn't show that decrease in driving ability. So because we're looking at those two levels of a participant variable, the two ages, and then comparing their ability on something, that's another indicator of that factorial design. So those are probably the easiest ways to identify these, but it's not always going to be super clear, and that's another one of those limitations of our popular media articles. And that brings us to the end of chapter 12. We will pick up next time where we start getting into sort of atypical experimental designs or pseudo-experimental designs. So those will be fun chapters to get into. I'll see you there.